The morning the Challenger left my life, the sky over Cape Canaveral was a blue so thin it felt like a promise. It sat on the horizon like a sheet of cheap glass, brittle and bright, and the wind came off the Atlantic in cold, metallic gusts that made the instruments chatter. I remember thinking, stupidly, that the sky looked impatient, like something that wanted to get on with itself before we could get out of the way. My name is Emily Hartman. I was 34. I wore my hair in a knot that morning because I didn't trust the wind, and I had learned to announce my presence in launch control without raising my voice. A soft tab against a doorframe, a steady breath, a handshake with the console. I'd spent the last 7 years of my life learning how to listen to the tiny things that try to tell you when a machine is about to fail. The way a valve hums, the way a pressure trace takes a breath. I told myself that made me safer than the rest of them, that intuition backed by data would keep me honest. It was January 28th, 1986. I had that date printed in my head like a stamp. We'd been through checklists so many times that the words were little mechanical prayers. Power verified, telemetry nominal, fuel lines purged. The crew, people I'd seen only in profile on posters and in photographs, people who were household names, were laughing in the crew quarters, nervous and precise. There was Krista McAuliffe's smile in every camera I passed. Something about the way she held her hands when she talked made me think of the teacher my mother had been, patient and fierce. That particular resemblance lodged in my chest and thudded there all day. My job had never been glamorous. I was a flight dynamics engineer, which in practice meant I read the language the rocket wrote in numbers and tried to predict its next sentence. You learn to translate noise into warning and to be concise enough that your words can be heard over the roar. That morning, my console was a constellation of green lights and narrow, humming cathode tubes. Outside, they were strapping people into seats that had no business holding a human life if anything beyond design went wrong. Inside, we were supposed to be the steady hands that kept chaos from touching them. Around 07 week, I walked out to the pad with a thermos of coffee and the stupid idea that the cold would be a novelty. The ocean sprayed grit on my boots, and the concrete smelled like salt. Engineers were clustered near the mobile service structure, faces wrapped in scarves, breath fogging. Someone joked about the temperature on live TV. Someone else muttered the word O-ring under their breath and tried to make it sound academic. I had heard the O-ring worry before. It was small talk at conferences and a headline in trade publications. Details about seals and resilience tested at room temperature and then asked to do strange things in the face of frost. It had, for a while, lived in a back drawer of technical memos. I felt it on the back of my neck like static, a memory of a meeting in the fall, of a whiteboard with scribbled curves and an underlined sentence. Temperature dependence. I remembered an engineer from a contractor, voice low and hurried, asking us to look at the cold weather data more carefully. We had run models, filed reports, and added contingencies. The bureaucracy of safety is porous. It holds, but not without friction. That morning, in the light that made everything too truthful, I realized we were holding our breath, not because we were sure, but because we had always been asked to. The micro hook was there, a fissure between what I felt and what the paper said. Back in the control room, the boards glittered. Mission control smelled like burnt coffee and antiseptic. Families and press packs were in the stands. Reporters craned necks like birds. I took my chair and toggled through the telemetry, watching numbers I knew as intimately as the lines on my own hands. Pressure climbed where it should. Temps stayed where they were predicted. The console for solid rocket booster performance, a narrow window of my responsibility, was calm, obedient. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of a loose thread that needed tugging. My notes from the night before were folded in my jacket pocket. A margin note, my handwriting quick and small, said, "Check low-temp seals on field joints. Ask for readout at T-45. T- times have a way of telescoping. 60 minutes becomes 6, becomes 10, becomes a single held breath. At T-45, the sequence would begin to march the way soldiers do in films, steady, regimented, inevitable. At T-45, I stood and walked to the comm hatch, asking for a clarity that I half expected not to have to ask for. Someone had already pulled the O-ring temp readouts into the console stream. It was in the data. The numbers were cold, literally. They were lower than the test conditions the SEALs had been rated for. A tiny bright alarm blinked on the peripheral screen, as if embarrassed at being seen. I called up the contractor feed. Theocol was a name that lived in the margins of many conversations. Technicians with coffee-stained sleeves who watched their work launch into the sky and hoped it would come back clean. Their voice on the line was clipped and practical. I asked the question the night had churned me awake for. Do the predicted joint temperatures meet the minimum cert temperatures for the material? A pause. The line hummed. Then, in a tone that sounded like a man carrying the weight of a long day, the engineer said, "No, they're marginal at best." The conversation that followed had the shape of a scale, 2 platters with a single fulcrum. On one side was schedule, public expectation, political theater, an economy that loves a launch, and a program that had always been allergic to delay. On the other side was metal science, a small piece of rubber that had been asked to bite down on a seam that, in cold, shrank and hardened like a mouth clamping around a stone. Someone in the room joked that the O-rings had better be warmer than the pundits. The joke sat badly in my throat. A micro-hook should not be subtle. It should be a splinter. Mine was when Theocol, quiet, firm, said they recommended a delay. The words fell into the room like a coin into a well. People glanced at the monitors. The program manager rubbed his jaw and mouthed to the operations chief. It was the kind of moment where you can tell the world is about to tilt. My pulse speed up into my throat. I remember thinking of the teacher my mother used to be, how she would stand and wait before speaking, weighing a word for the kid who might misunderstand. There was a teacher on that shuttle. I could not make my thoughts into a logic that justified silence. But history is not only made in the command room. It is also negotiated in conference rooms, with coffee stains and contracts. I watched a chain of briefings I wasn't allowed into unfold on the console readouts. Calls to the vehicle management office, a conferencing buzz of voices. The recommendation to delay shuddered across the wires, and the immediate response was a replay of all the reasons not to. The television crew scheduled to film a teacher in space, the families in the stands, the political capital of a successful mission. The microhook here was the room full of professionals, suddenly trying to argue for certainty when what they had was urgency. I have always believed in the slow work of persuasion, in the moral force of hard facts. That morning, I found myself caught in an older, louder force. The inertia of expectation. An operations guy I respected, quiet, with a hope-worn face, put his hand on my shoulder and said, "We can't stop this," like it would reassure me. It didn't. I walked to the window and watched the gantry, thinking of the metal the cold had made brittle. We were in a push-pull between 2 kinds of courage, the courage to delay and the courage to proceed. The weird, painful truth about launch work is that courage often wears the shape of compliance. Someone must go forward. I heard muffled arguments about probabilities and acceptable risk. I heard someone carefully list precedents, decisions we'd made under similar pressures, where the calculus had given us the green. I also heard the quieter voice of a contractor's engineer, nailed to their own data, insist that the seals were compromised by the cold. Whatever decisions were being exercised in closed doors, in the end, a set of determinations came back across the line. The launch would proceed. There was, for me, a flash of righteous fury that was almost adolescent. How dare a decision that affected lives be made against the caution of those who understood the hardware? But anger dissolves fast in the face of duty. We had a launch window, a public, and a trained crew who had trusted us with their lives. We had all taken oaths, written and moral, to keep things as safe as possible. That morning, those two ideas nodded in a way that refused comforting resolution. Around T-10 minutes, I remember the way the lights in the block dim with each sequence stage, as if the universe itself were drawing down. The announcer's voice on the public feed was a warm thing, narrating the well-rehearsed human drama. Crew has been cleared for flight. The words were like an echo behind glass. My hands on the console were steady because my body had learned to keep them so. Inside, my stomach translated the rising fuel pressures into a physical ache. We checked off the boxes. The board said go in that flat, clinical way only machines can. I had, for a half second, a ridiculous fantasy that if I pressed my palm to the console long enough, I could warm something, transfer my small human heat into circuits, into O-rings, into the doors of the capsule. It was a child's magic, and I indulged it because logic was no comfort. People said their goodbyes in public, smiles that were too bright, like actors who know that the audience mustn't smell fear. Krista's laugh came through a feed, light and surprising. I felt my eyes burn and had to blink it away. Someone passed me a note that said, "We're clear." It might as well have said, "Proceed." Then the ignition sequence ate the countdown and became its own engine of sound, the thrust built in a way that made the world feel as though it had been tilted on its axis. My micro-hook here was not technical, but visceral. The sound was wrong in a way that made me look up. Ignitions have a cadence, a rhythm that my bones memorized over the years. That morning, there was an extra hiccup in a tone I couldn't name. It should have been part of the orchestra of controlled chaos, but it felt like a note sung off-key at the moment a choir reaches the chorus. We watched on the monitors as the shuttle rose, a white streak against the glass of morning. For the length of an exhale, it was pure, a triumph of geometry and engineering. And then, like a screen tearing in the middle of a film, the world changed. Smoke curled in a way that textbooks do not have words for. The first reports over the comm line were clipped, baffled. External tank separation? No. And then the line went bright and raw with noise. My headset crackled with 1,000 voices, speaking only once and then repeating. The console in front of me went dizzy with alarms. I felt my body go fort still and then, unpredictably, move anyway, toward the screens. The thing the cameras showed would live in my dreams forever. A white ribbon of debris snapping away from the main flame. A shape that had been a promise becoming a scatter of fragments. The micro-hook hit like an animal. Disbelief morphing into an understanding that the trajectory we had predicted had altered, violently and irrevocably. The shouting around me was a distant impression, everything condensed into a single scream that I will never unhear. The human sound of realization, of something precious and ordinary slipping away. I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt obscene, of my mother's hands smoothing homework papers at a kitchen table. I thought of students in classrooms waiting for the demonstration that would never come. I thought, and this thought is what made my chest implode, of the teacher strapped in that seat, trusting a program that had told the country it could carry her weight. We had given our word, in numbers and in ritual, and that word had broken. The immediate technical readouts were a tangle. Sensors dropping out, telemetry losing lock, a plume that did not match any predicted dispersion models. My training sent me toward analysis. What failed? Where did the chain break? But there was also a part of me that turned inward, that wanted to be raw and simply say the only clear fact: something had gone terribly wrong. The room dissolved into controlled chaos, people barking for data, others moving like people in a different language. I found my hands in my lap, fingers unfurling as if from the knowledge that they could not fix what had happened. There is a moment after a cataclysm when the world composes itself into something new. For me, that moment was thick and slow and smelled like burnt insulation. Later, there would be committees and memos and hearings. Technical diagrams turned into evidence. But in the first terrible hour, we had only the stain on the sky and the low, steady voice of someone reading the manifest. Names were spoken into microphones and then into waiting, grief-struck air. The people who had been on that flight. Krista's name came like a struck bell. I felt selfishly as if I had to stand and make my own small declaration of accountability. I had been there. I had known the cold. I had not been able to make the world agree with me. One of my colleagues, the quiet man who had tried to reassure me earlier, sat down hard and whispered something I could not bear to hear. He folded his head into his hands, like a person who had been personally wounded. The micro-hook was here. The knowledge that the same people who build miracles are the ones left to clean up after them. They will be the ones to find the reason, and also the ones to keep living with the memory. We began, then, the business of answering impossible questions. We do not have another word for the shock of watching a machine you love betray you, so we invented committees. I will not describe them now. The bureaucracy will come later, in hearings where certainty is polished into phrases and blame is bracketed carefully by lawyers. For the moment, the control room was a place of stunned silence that occasionally broke into action. A phone call to a family member, a reporter's microphone, the voice of a president promising inquiry. I remember stepping outside into the cold that had felt like an omen and watching the sky where the shuttle had been, a place suddenly too clear, as if the clouds had washed themselves clean of possibility. In those hours, 1,000 private histories intersected. The families who would enter a new kind of living, the engineers who would replay their decisions on a loop, the contractor man who had said delay and would live with that voice for the rest of his life. I walked to the parking lot and leaned against my car, feeling like a foreigner in my own skin. The world had not ended. The machines that make our lives possible continued to hum. But something inside me had. I do not know if the micro-hooks were kind or cruel that day. They were necessary, little cuts that pried open the truth. There would be more. The hearings, the testimony that would reveal seals and cold, and the places where we had let momentum and showmanship press harder than caution. For now, though, there was only me and the raw, aching knowledge that the sky had taken something from us that could not easily be returned. I thought of the students who would never see their teacher float above them. I thought of the small acts of courage that get lost under the weight of spectacle. I made a decision in that parking lot that tasted like rust and salt. I would not make the easy choice to close my mouth and go back to the way things were. I would push in the way I could, through reports, through data, by refusing to let the story be simplified into safe phrases. It felt like the only act of fidelity left to the people who had trusted us. I folded my hands into the pocket of my coat, felt the cold bite through the fabric, and climbed back inside. The consoles glowed like a constellation that had just lost a star, waiting for us to relight it with truth. The weeks after the explosion felt like living inside an echo. Every sound came back slower, heavier, thick with meaning I didn't want to understand. My alarm clock rang the same, my coffee tasted the same, my car made the same old rattle in the steering column, but I moved through all of it like a ghost in borrowed skin. People on base walked with the same stunned expression, like they were all waiting for someone to announce that it had all been a simulation, a cruel rehearsal, a mistake in interpretation rather than reality. But the sky over the Cape stayed the same impossible blue, and reality stayed exactly what it was. We had lost 7 people, and we had to tell the world why. For the first few days, the halls of Mission Control were wrapped in silence. Every conversation felt like walking on cracked ice. We'd whisper out of habit, as though speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile order was left. Visitors came in waves, officials, investigators, administrators, moving through the building like they were afraid to inhale too deeply. I kept my badge clipped to my collarbone as if it were the only thing tying me to gravity. I'd stayed in my office until midnight on most nights, surrounded by stacks of telemetry printouts. I stared at the same numbers again and again, though I already knew what they would say. The O-rings had been cold. The seals had not flexed as designed. Combustion gas had slipped past, burned through a joint, triggered the unthinkable. The numbers were facts, but facts weren't the same as accountability. I knew what was coming long before the official memo landed on my desk. The hearings, the Blue Ribbon Commission, the testimonies. The nation wanted answers, and we were going to be the ones to provide them. My name appeared on page 3 of the witness list. The night before I was scheduled to testify, I drove to Cocoa Beach and walked along the shoreline. The wind cut through my coat. Every wave felt like a question hitting my ankles with cold persistence. Out on the horizon, a lone fishing boat moved through the dark like a slow pulse. I tilted my head back and looked at the emptiness above me, the sky that had taken 7 lives and hadn't flinched. I whispered into it, not expecting an answer. "Tell the truth," I said to myself, "no matter what it costs." I repeated it like a vow. The hearing room in Washington glowed under television lights that made every face look composed and exhausted at the same time. Rows of microphones lined the long mahogany table like a row of polished weapons. Reporters whispered in clusters. Cameras hummed. Behind me, an audience of grieving families sat with folded hands and unreadable eyes. I kept my gaze forward. It wasn't that I didn't want to face them. I simply didn't trust myself not to break. When my name was called, I stood. My legs felt like they were made of glass. I walked to the microphone and placed my hands on the table, realizing too late that they were trembling. My prepared statement was printed neatly in my folder. I didn't open it. "I am Emily Hartman," I began. "Flight dynamics engineer for Shuttle mission STS-51L. I'm here to tell you what I knew when I knew it, and what I failed to prevent." A hush spread through the room. I took a breath that felt like swallowing a stone. On the morning of the launch, I was concerned about the temperature and its impact on the solid rocket booster O-ring seals. I contacted the contractor for clarification. They advised that the joint temperatures did not meet the certified minimum criteria. One of the commissioners leaned forward. "Are you saying you communicated this concern before launch?" "Yes." My voice didn't shake this time. The concern was known. It was raised. It was documented verbally and in our internal checks. Did anyone in a position of authority insist on delay based on that information? Yes, the contractor recommended a delay. And NASA management? I felt the words burn inside me. They declined to implement that recommendation. The launch proceeded. Silence, heavy and electric. I didn't look at the families behind me, but I felt something shift in the air, as if the truth had cracked open a door that would never close again. "Why?" a commissioner asked. "Was a launch allowed to proceed when the contractor recommended it not?" "Because pressure rolls downhill. Because pride speaks louder than caution. Because institutions build momentum faster than people can stop them. Because we let ourselves believe that past success guaranteed future safety. But I answered simply, because they believed the risk was acceptable. And what did you believe? For a moment, the entire world narrowed to a pinpoint, a single flicker of memory. The cold biting my cheeks, the blinking red on my peripheral screen, the voice on the phone saying the word marginal. I believed the risk was real, I said, and I didn't fight hard enough. My voice fractured at the edges. I didn't care. If I could take back the silence I kept, if I could turn my concerns into something loud enough to stop the countdown, I would. I would trade anything for that. A murmur rippled through the room. Sympathy from some, suspicion from others. But I had spoken the only truth that mattered. Responsibility wasn't a straight line. It was a web, and I was part of it. Another commissioner spoke, softer. Ms. Hartman, do you believe this tragedy was preventable? I closed my eyes. Yes. The word dropped like a match into dry grass. The questioning went on for hours. Technical explanations, temperature charts, case studies, historical context. Every sentence felt like walking barefoot across glass. But I stayed steady, because I owed steadiness to the people who had climbed into that shuttle, trusting us. When it was over, I stepped away from the microphone. The room buzzed with whispers and rustling papers. I was halfway to the door when a hand touched my forearm. I turned. It was Krista McAuliffe's husband. He looked at me for a long moment. His eyes held no anger, only a grief so deep it made me want to collapse. Thank you, he said quietly. I shook my head. I didn't do enough. You told the truth, he whispered. That's more than most. I swallowed hard. I'm so sorry. He nodded, squeezed my arm once, and let go. I watched him walk back to his seat, shoulders heavy with the unbearable. I wondered if anything I had said would ever matter in the way he deserved. I doubted it. But he had given me a small grace I didn't know how to hold. The months that followed were filled with reconstruction efforts. Engineering teams tore apart the booster joints, sketched new cross-sections, tested new seals. Committees rewrote procedures and quality controls. People who had been blind to risk now scrutinized every seal, every bolt, every rivet. It was an avalanche of accountability, slow but unstoppable. For the first time since the accident, I felt like the truth had momentum. One afternoon, deep in the summer heat, I stood on the gantry beside a prototype segment of redesigned booster casing. Engineers buzzed around me, measuring, adjusting, arguing over tolerances. I pressed my palm against the metal, warm from the sun, and felt something unfamiliar. Hope. Not for redemption, not for absolution, but for change. I thought of the teacher who never got to finish her lesson, the commander who wouldn't come home, the crew who had looked into cameras with steady confidence. I thought of the roar of ignition, the terror in the sky, the silence that followed, and I promised them something I could finally honor. I would never be quiet again. Years later, in a hearing room for a different mission, I found myself at another microphone. My hair had gone a little gray at the edges. My voice was steadier. And when the questions came about risk, about ethics, about responsibility, I answered with the same vow I had made on a cold Florida beach the night before the first hearing. Tell the truth, no matter what it costs. The Challenger crew became part of me, of all of us. Their names were etched into stone monuments and into the invisible architecture of every change NASA made afterward. Every time a new shuttle launched, safer, stronger, redesigned from the bones outward, I felt a small piece of them lift with it. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I walk the shoreline of Cocoa Beach again. The wind still cuts, the waves still ask their questions, and the horizon looks as indifferent as ever. But I stand there anyway, letting the cold bite my skin, letting memory do what it must. I speak to the sky, not for absolution, but for witness. We learned, I tell it. It cost too much, but we learned. And the wind carries the words away, scattering them into the same thin blue air that once promised everything and took everything back. I close my eyes, breathe deep, and feel something like peace settle in my chest. Not forgiveness, not closure, just truth. And sometimes, just sometimes, that is enough.